Now that we have an understanding of the concept of wrapping and unwrapping elements with that burrito example, we're going to do that live by creating a node now that collects things from Revit. This will be in Visual Studio, and we will cover the wrapping and unwrapping topics pretty extensively in this lesson. This lesson's for getting Revit data. We're going to find an API method that doesn't exist in Dynamo. If it does at this point, we're going to pretend it doesn't, and we're going to make it anyway. And we're going to implement that in our ZeroTouch C# code for our nodes, load that into Dynamo for Revit, and see how it works. A lot in this lesson, but we are going to get back into coding, and you're going to make your first ZeroTouch node that works within Dynamo for Revit and interacts with the Revit API. In the lesson notes, there is a link for the exact class that we're working with, so that way you can click on that and visit that, but you can follow along and we're going to find the methods that we use. With that in mind, let's go ahead and fire up our Visual Studio solution and start making a node. All right, so here we are in Visual Studio. You should have the solution saved still. You should have it version controlled on GitHub, and you should be caught up in that way. To reiterate, as a review of where we're at, we have NuGet packages loaded. So right-clicking on References, Manage NuGet Packages, we will see that we have a few installed in our Visual Studio project. They are all for the Dynamo version for Revit 24. If you aren't caught up to this point, in the notes for this lesson is a zip file of the code at this current state, so that way you can be caught up if something happened to your code. I encourage you to use GitHub though, like we covered in a previous lesson, to sync this code and be able to follow along. But for some reason you need a starting point, the code is in there in a zip file. Download that, unzip it, open it, and you'll be right here. That way you can follow along for this lesson. In this case, we still have our first node, ZeroTouch Unraveled node. What we are going to do is we're going to implement a structure now to be able to build nodes for Dynamo for Revit. In order to understand how we want to structure our code, let's jump into Dynamo for Revit and take a quick look. If you don't have Revit open at this time, you can just watch along with this. But what we are going to do is take a look at the Revit category in the library. If we drag this, we can make it a little bigger. Scrolling our mouse wheel will make the text bigger. So another tip for you. If we go to Revit, we can take a look at all of the different elements available to us, all the different data types. So we have Revit, Analytical Automation, Analyze, Application, Elements, which is that base class of a lot of these different elements in Revit. We have ceilings in here, walls, dimensions, filled regions, floors, all the different element types that we expect in Revit. Another class that we have that we can work with are views. So we have area plan views, ceiling plans, view, 3D views, all sorts of different ones, and we have sheets as well. In this case, we are going to recreate this node for views, and we're going to output some additional data from it. So that is what we are going to recreate. A lot of nodes exist in Dynamo now, but we can find new API methods and manipulate them and make them our own and have our own versions of nodes as well. So what we do want to do is mimic this kind of structure. So we have Revit, views, sheet. That's what we want to mimic for this node. Back in Visual Studio, we can go ahead and right click on the ZeroTouch Unraveled. We'll go to add a new folder. So we should have new folder over here on the screen. So what we'll do is I'm going to drag this to the side so that way we can see it. Right click, add new folder, and we're going to name this one Revit. Right click, add new folder. We're going to name this one views and add new folder. And we're going to name this one sheet. This helps us mimic that structure so that when we place a node, it is in that correct category for us within the library for our ZeroTouch package. So this is something we want to establish early. Could you just put everything in my nodes? Absolutely, yes, you can. That's not a problem. But ensuring that we have a good structure from the beginning is pretty key and something that I think is pretty important. In this case, what we will do is go ahead and add a new item. We're going to add a sheet.cs. So a class for sheet. In this case, we actually don't need it to be nested one more folder because a class is its own category itself. So we can just drag this up to views, click OK, and actually remove that folder. So we don't want to nest too far. That's one thing that we want to keep in mind. We can see that we have sheet.cs. By adding this to Visual Studio 2022, it did mark it as internal. So that is something to consider. We want this to be public if we recall from an earlier lesson. In this case, we're getting the little note for not having documentation. So if we were to go in and hit 3 slashes, we will say wrapper class for sheets. You don't need that summary. That's not a requirement, but if you want to minimize some of the errors within Visual Studio itself, you can do that and it makes it a little bit easier. The next thing we want to do is if we look back at our first node, we will see that we have this private section here on 15. We want to do the same thing for this sheet because we don't want to have that show up as a blank node in Dynamo, as you might recall from that previous lesson. In this case, we're good to go from that point of view. And what we're going to go ahead and do is make a node that gets all the views on a sheet. So what we'll do is public static, which tells the compiler we want to make a node, and then we figure out what we want to return. In this case, let's go ahead and just return an integer for now. We're going to return the view count at this point, and then we'll return the views later. And then we're going to say views. And now we have our views getting returned. So our node's going to be called sheet.views in our case within our custom package. We do need an input, so we have to put in a parenthesis. Visual Studio is smart to where it gives us another parenthesis, and then we'll do curly braces as well and hit enter. You'll see that we have a red error because we're not returning anything yet, so this node's not happy quite yet, and we are missing our comments as well. So we are missing a few things, so Visual Studio is mad. In this case, we do want to be able to input a sheet into this node. Back in Dynamo for Revit, let's take a quick look at that. What we're going to go ahead and do is, once again, you don't have to follow along for this, but I'm going to select an individual sheet element, and that should work. And we're going to do object type and see what object type we're dealing with. After a while, this will just become familiar to you, but we are dealing with a revit.elements.views.sheet. So it is interesting, it is still in that elements class, but in the library it is located in Revit views sheet. The funny thing, you will start to see some of those kind of inconsistencies as well. So what we are going to do is hard code our node to look for an element of this type. In Visual Studio, as you might recall from our first node, we need to have our object type, the variable name, and then we can have an optional default value. For most Revit nodes, you aren't going to have a default value for an element because you don't want it to run unless someone inputs something, so keep that in mind. And we're going to go ahead and type in revit.elements.views.sheet. Revit.element.views.sheet. In this case, we will see that we are missing something in this case. It doesn't know what we're referencing, and that's because we have to double check that we have that Dynamo Revit package reference in our NuGet packages. So we're going to right click and say manage NuGet. We do have Revit referenced, so we're good from that point of view. And we'll go back to our sheets and take a quick look. In our Visual Studio solution for ZeroTouch nodes, we are mimicking that naming convention of the library within Dynamo for Revit. So one thing to keep in mind is since we are mimicking that, we do have revit.views.sheet. So there starts to be a bit of a clash between what's built into Revit. The easiest way to fix this, and you're going to see this all over the references within Archilab and Rhythm and all the ZeroTouch packages, is we just type in the word global, : in front of the object type. What that's saying is to use something outside of our solution to create that type. So in this case, we have our sheet getting reference from our revit.elements data types in the Dynamo Revit API. A lot to think about, but this global thing is going to be something you see all the time and you'll find yourself typing all the time. If you wanted to avoid that, you could change your using up here if you wanted. So you could say using Revit Elements View Sheet. So that's one thing that you could do. These using statements do get a little bit confusing sometimes. So if you were to remove this global now, you will see that it's still freaking out. They are okay. The global kind of helps a lot with that. And that tool that I mentioned in a previous lesson, ReSharper, helps with this a whole lot as well. So you will have to add using sometimes. In this case, if we do the global, we'll be good from that point of view. We'll add them as we run into them though. Our variable name is just going to be lowercase s sheet. And there we go. In this case, we can start interacting with the sheet object now at this point. So in Visual Studio, if we type in sheet dot, you will see all the different things that are available to us. This views is the one that we just created, so ignore that one. But we have add filter, our joined, bounding box, can view be duplicated, crop box, geometry, get location, all these different things that are just inherently available in Dynamo. So these are all options that Dynamo already has. Views is already in there once again, but we're going to pretend it's not for this example. Set scale, set sheet name. So if we look at set sheet name and set scale, those should be in here as well. So all those different things are in here in that views class within the Revit API for Dynamo. In our case, we want to change this to a different data type. So we're going to go ahead and jump on over to api.docs.co and take a look at the view sheet class. So another data type that is in the Revit API is view sheet. In Dynamo, that's just sheet. So there is a little bit of an inconsistency there that you just need to keep in mind. In this case, we can see that if we use a view sheet element, we can get all placed views and all these kind of things. You will see that get all placed views is a different method than what we're seeing when we hit dot in Visual Studio. That's just sheet.views because that's the Dynamo node that's available to us. There is no get all views. If you type that in, there's nothing. That's because we aren't working with a view sheet element. We're working with a Dynamo Revit element that is sheet. So we need to cast this. That's where the wrapping and unwrapping starts to happen. So in this case, we'll jump back over here to our browser and we'll see that we are working with a view sheet. So what I'll do is I'll just copy view sheet. You can type it. We're going to type view sheet. We'll see that it's freaking out. It's asking us what's going on. Why aren't we knowing what that means? We'll ignore that for now. We're going to make a variable called view sheet equals. In this case, we are still missing something. We're missing a reference. We need to reference the Revit API. So in our using statements, we actually need to reference the Revit API. At this point, we've referenced the Dynamo Revit API. At no point have we referenced just the raw Revit API. How are we going to do that? We're going to once again revisit our NuGet packages. In this case, we're going to go to browse, so browse on NuGet. We're going to type in Revit API. And the one I really like to use is Revit all main versions. But if you click on this, you will see that we have a few different versions. We are in Revit 24, so we're going to click install. It runs everything and gives you a pop-up saying it's done. We'll close that and we'll close NuGet. And we'll see that we are now in our class for the sheet. In this case, Visual Studio is being smart enough now to tell us that we might want to add a using statement. So as long as you have the right DLLs referenced, Visual Studio should help you take care of that. Once again, ReSharper, that paid tool, does this even better for you. It actually references things if it's missing, so it finds it for you. But Visual Studio 2022 is pretty good at it. If we click on that, it adds a using for us. It turns white because it's being used instead of this kind of translucent color. And we will see that view sheet is starting to be corrected in this case, which is pretty awesome. In this case, we will go ahead and do equals. We're going to say sheet. That's our variable from our input. And we're going to do dot internal element. Visual Studio, once again, is helping us out a ton by telling us, hey, this is just going to be a autodesk.revit.db element. Do you want this to be a view sheet instead? Hitting tab will do that for us. So now we can see that our variable view sheet is a view sheet element type. So let's go ahead and add a note to this. So we're going to say this casts the Dynamo Revit view or the Dynamo Revit sheet to a Revit.db view sheet, just to remind ourselves what it's doing. So that's where that magic happens at this point. If we go ahead and hit enter a few times, Visual Studio is trying to do a whole lot of other stuff for us. We'll ignore that for now, but we'll type in our variable name, so view dot. Now we have access, this little scroll bar is way bigger. So we have access to a whole lot more elements to be able to work with. If we type in get, you will see get all place views is an option for us. That's in the raw Revit API. That is not a Dynamo Revit thing. That is something that we're getting right from the Revit API. So once again, this get all placed views right here, that's what we're going to be using. So we've now cast our Revit object in Dynamo into a raw Revit database object. So we're going to do get all placed views dot get. If we put a semicolon, we will see that it's mad, and that's because we are missing that little marker at the end of it. So these two parentheses. So that is required for this method in this case. So we'll jump back over here. We'll type those two. and we'll see that it's happy. At this point, we're not using this for anything, so we can create a variable to just kind of hold these things. So at the beginning of line 25 right here, we can go ahead and type in var, which kind of lets Visual Studio figure out what we're working with. And we'll say views with a lowercase p. Hovering on this, we will see that it's returning it as a variable type that we didn't define. So in this case, it's a iSet of element IDs, so a weird one, but all we want to do is obtain the count from this. In this case, our node's not done yet because we still haven't returned anything quite yet. So what we want to do is placed views dot, and if we type in count, we are seeing that we can get the count from that, and we do need to return that as a value. So we're going to do return placed views dot count. So on this placed views, if you hit dot, you'll start to see all the different options available to us and counts in there. So we are just going to use what's built in. So now we are getting all of our view counts. In this case, we have views. Let's go ahead and rename this to get all placed views. That way it mimics what's in the API. That makes a little more sense to me. In this case, it is still upset because we are missing our XML comments. So that is one thing that it's not happy about. So we do need to come in and do the 3 slashes to add our summary. So something that we need to do to document our nodes as we work through. You don't have to do this every time. It is one of those things though that it is good to do as you go along. So we will get all placed views on the input sheet. We'll just leave it there for now for this example. We'll go ahead and hit save all. Now's probably a good time to jump to GitHub and sync. So we're going to say create a new view, sheet view count, and we're going to go ahead and sync this to GitHub with commit all and push. So at this point, nothing's loaded in Revit quite yet. So what we are going to do is we're going to click on build solution. We will see that it built all of that. We have our source debug folder right here. So that's one thing that changed. And as always, an easy way to get to our code is to right click and say open folder in File Explorer. We have this right here, bin debug. We will see all of these dependencies are getting built as well. Don't include these in your package. We'll get into that at a later lesson. And we will find our DLL in here as well. So let's go ahead and find ZeroTouch unraveled. It's a Z, so it should be all the way at the bottom. We'll right click and copy this as a path. And now in Dynamo for Revit, so if you don't have Revit open, get it open. We are going to import our node. In this case, I'll zoom out. We are just in a Revit file. We are in the sample file, and we have Dynamo open. For now, we're going to go ahead and go to this little plus icon and paste in our path of our ZeroTouch unraveled.dll. We'll go ahead and click open. We will see ZeroTouch unraveled show up in our library. Expanding this, we have our my first node still, which still works, which is pretty awesome. And we have Revit sheet. So we now have that broken down into those categories for us, which is really nice. We actually have an extra sheet in here, and I'll show you why in a moment. If we place the get all placed views node, we can search for a sheets node, which is in Dynamo, and just pick a sheet. And now we'll see that as we change the sheet input, we are getting a count of views on the sheets. So our node's working, it's firing off, and we're obtaining data right from our Revit model using the API. Right now, we're just importing the count. We're not outputting like all the different views, so we will do that next. But that is our first node at this point. The other consideration with Dynamo for Revit is we can't rebuild it while Revit's running. We ran into this in Dynamo Sandbox as well. So what we are going to do is we will have to close Dynamo and Revit to rebuild our node. In a later lesson, we'll look at debugging and changing code on the fly. It's pretty neat in Visual Studio. But for now, we're going to close Revit, build our node, and all those good things. So at this point, you have a node that gets all the place views, the count. We do have a section B to this lesson to where we are going to change this to get the views. We didn't want this one to be a really long video. So what we'll do is get Revit restarted. Don't open Dynamo yet, and we'll jump back in and build that node in the next lesson. So with that in mind, we'll see you in that next lesson.